Welcome to Life Stories, where we explore tales that touch the heart and inspire the soul. Today, we bring you the captivating journey of Ethan and Emily, a story that begins with a contract and blossoms into an extraordinary love that conquers all odds. Through challenges, betrayals, and unexpected twists, they discover the power of trust, resilience, and the courage to choose love. Join us as we dive into their unforgettable story, filled with emotion, profound lessons, and the beauty of transformation. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories to follow along and start today's journey with us. The city skyline stretched out before Ethan Carter like a canvas painted in muted golds and deep purples, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside his heart. From the top floor of Carter Enterprises, his world looked as pristine and unshakable as the glass towers below. Yet within his office, chaos reigned. On his mahogany desk lay a stack of papers that seemed to weigh more than the towering buildings outside, divorce papers. Ethan wasn't a man who failed often. At 35, he had built an empire that stretched across continents, conquering boardrooms and markets with the same precision that had once made him the star of his small Midwestern hometown. But this was different. Marriage wasn't a hostile takeover or a market challenge, it was supposed to be about trust, about partnership. Yet here he was, staring at proof of betrayal, wondering how he had missed the signs. His soon-to-be ex-wife, Lauren Bennett, had been a picture of perfection, sophisticated, poised, and ambitious. They had met at a gala 3 years ago, an encounter orchestrated by mutual friends. She was everything he thought he wanted, a polished match for a man in his position. But as Ethan now knew, Lauren's polish was only surface deep, hiding a ruthless opportunist beneath. "Mr. Carter," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, cutting through his thoughts. "The board is waiting in conference room A. I'll be there in 5. Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. He straightened his tie and adjusted the cuffs of his charcoal suit. Armor against a world that had taught him long ago never to show weakness. As he left his office, the golden light of the setting sun caught the edges of the city, casting long shadows that mirrored the secrets he was still uncovering. Lauren's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional. She had used her position as his wife to feed information to Logan Harper, CEO of Harper Global, a rival company that had been circling Carter Enterprises for years. It wasn't until 3 weeks ago that Ethan had discovered the depth of her deceit. A routine report from a private investigator had landed in his inbox that morning, its contents unraveling the threads of his carefully constructed life. Images of Lauren in clandestine meetings, documents proving her involvement in sharing sensitive company information. It was a betrayal that cut deeper than he cared to admit. As he entered the boardroom, the familiar hum of his company surrounded him. The men and women seated around the polished table rose slightly, their respect for him evident in their gestures. But he knew what they were thinking. The headlines about his impending divorce were impossible to escape. They didn't say it aloud, but their concern was written on their faces. How would this affect the company? Ethan addressed the meeting with the same precision he brought to every challenge, fielding questions and presenting strategies with unwavering confidence. Yet, as the meeting wrapped up, one issue loomed unresolved: Carter Enterprises' succession policy, a relic of his late father's traditional values. The company's bylaws required the CEO to be married and to have an heir to secure control. With his marriage ending, the whispers about his future had grown louder. Later that evening, Ethan returned to his office. The city below was a sea of twinkling lights. But the view brought no comfort. Instead, he poured himself a glass of scotch, the burn of the liquor offering a momentary reprieve. His father's voice echoed in his mind, a memory from the day he took over the company: "Never let them see you bleed, son." Ethan's phone buzzed. A message from his younger sister. "Claire, come home. You need to rest." A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Claire had always been his anchor, the one person who saw the man beneath the CEO. But rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not when the sharks were circling. The knock at his door was expected. Marcus Chen, his head of legal, stepped in, holding a folder. "The divorce settlement is ready for your review," Marcus said, placing the papers on the desk. Ethan nodded. "And the board's concerns?" "They're pushing for stability," Marcus replied. "Harper Global's latest moves have made them nervous. The shareholders want reassurance." Ethan's gaze shifted to the city skyline. "Reassurance," he repeated, the word bitter on his tongue. How did one reassure a boardroom of vultures waiting for the first sign of weakness? "There is a way," Marcus said hesitantly. "A contract marriage. It's not uncommon in our circles." Ethan's initial reaction was to dismiss the idea outright. A contract marriage? It felt cold. Calculated, everything love wasn't supposed to be. But as the minutes passed, the practicality of it began to settle in his mind. No emotions. No chances for betrayal. Just clear terms and mutual benefit. "Draw up a preliminary contract," he said finally. "Ironclad. Leave no room for interpretation." Marcus nodded. "Any specific requirements for the candidate?" Ethan thought for a moment. "Someone intelligent. A professional background. No ties to any competing corporations. And no one from Lauren's social circle." That night, Ethan stayed in his office. The city's lights fading into the early morning haze. The idea of a contract marriage wasn't just about protecting his company, it was about protecting himself. He had once believed in love. In happy endings. But not anymore. This time, marriage would be what it should have been all along, a business arrangement. Nothing more. Or so he thought. Across town, in a modest apartment, Emily Davis sat at her desk, surrounded by stacks of financial reports and medical bills. At 28, she was the youngest financial analyst at Sterling and Associates. But her late nights weren't just about proving herself. Every extra hour she worked meant another dollar toward her mother's medical treatment. Her phone buzzed, displaying an unknown number. Normally, she would let it go to voicemail. But something made her answer. "Miss Davis," a crisp voice inquired. "This is Marcus Chen from Carter Enterprises. We'd like to discuss a business proposition." Emily's heart raced as the man explained the offer, a meeting the following morning. A confidential matter that could be life-changing. She agreed. Curiosity and desperation outweighing caution. As she hung up, her thoughts turned to her mother. The overdue bills. And the life she had been fighting so hard to hold together. Little did she know. The call would set her on a path that would challenge everything she thought she knew about herself and about love. The next morning, Emily stood in front of the Carter Enterprises building. Her breath catching as she took in the sheer scale of it. The skyscraper rose high above the bustling streets. A gleaming monument to wealth and power. She adjusted her navy blazer and squared her shoulders. If she was going to meet the legendary Ethan Carter, she needed to channel every ounce of confidence she had. A sleek black sedan had picked her up earlier. A courtesy she hadn't expected but appreciated. As the car wove through the city, she couldn't help but wonder why Carter Enterprises, one of the most prestigious companies in the country, would be interested in her. She was good at her job. Sure. But her name wasn't exactly making waves in the financial world. The security protocols inside the building were rigorous, adding to her nervous energy. After passing through multiple checkpoints, she was led to a private elevator. The mirrored walls reflected her anxious expression as she smoothed her honey-blonde hair into place. The car ride had been long enough to second-guess everything. Was this a job offer? A consultancy role? She'd never dealt directly with the company before. So why now? The elevator opened directly into a modern reception area. Marcus Chen, the man she had spoken to on the phone, greeted her with a warm but professional smile. "Miss Davis," he said, extending his hand. "Thank you for coming on such short notice." "Of course," Emily replied, shaking his hand firmly. "Though I admit, I'm still unclear on what this is about. You'll understand shortly, Marcus assured her, leading her into a conference room. The walls were floor-to-ceiling glass, offering a breathtaking view of the city. But Emily barely noticed. Her focus was drawn to the man standing at the head of the table. Ethan Carter was taller than she had imagined, his presence commanding. His tailored charcoal suit emphasized his broad shoulders, and his steel-gray eyes were as sharp as they were unreadable. There was something about him that exuded authority, but there was also a weariness in his expression that made her pause. This wasn't just a CEO, this was a man carrying an enormous weight. "Miss Davis," Ethan said, his voice deep and smooth, though it held a hint of exhaustion. "Thank you for coming. Please, sit." Emily Saturday, acutely aware of his piercing gaze. She folded her hands in her lap, trying to maintain a semblance of calm even as her mind raced. "You've made an impression," Ethan began, cutting straight to the point. "Your analysis on the Morrison Group's financial strategies caught my attention. Your insight into their pattern of hostile takeovers was particularly astute." Emily blinked, surprised. That analysis was still in progress, not yet finalized or submitted to her supervisors. "I'm curious how you came across my work," she said cautiously. "We have our ways," Ethan replied, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "More importantly, it demonstrates exactly the kind of mind I need." "For what exactly?" Emily asked, her heart pounding. Marcus slid a document across the table toward her. "We're offering you a business proposition," he said. "A marriage contract. 2 years minimum, with specific terms and substantial compensation." Emily's breath caught as she scanned the first page. The numbers alone were staggering enough to cover her mother's treatment 10 times over. She forced herself to remain calm, but her hands trembled slightly as she turned the page. "Why me?" she asked, finally looking up. Her voice was steady, but the question was genuine. "Surely there are dozens of women in your social circles who would jump at this." "That's precisely why you," Ethan replied, leaning forward slightly. "You're intelligent, capable, and discreet. You have no connections to competing corporations or social circles that could pose a conflict of interest." And he added, his eyes softening almost imperceptibly, "You have a pressing need that we can help with." Emily's mind raced. This wasn't a job offer, this was something much more complicated. "And what would be required of me?" she asked. "Public appearances as my wife," Ethan replied, his tone measured. "Residency in my penthouse. Participation in social events relevant to the company. And," he hesitated, his expression hardening slightly, "an heir within the 2-year period." The clinical way he said it made her stomach twist. She placed the contract down, her hands clasped tightly together. "And if I refuse?" "You're free to walk away," Ethan said, his tone even. "But this is a chance to change your life, Miss Davis. For both of us." She stared at him, weighing the implications. This wasn't just about money or stability, it was about control of her life, of her choices. But then she thought of her mother, pale and brave in her hospital bed, and the crushing weight of medical bills that seemed insurmountable. Could she really walk away from this opportunity? "I'll need time to think," Emily said finally. "You have until 5 p.m. today." Ethan replied, "I have a board meeting at 6 where I need to present either a signed contract or an alternate solution." When she left the building, her mind was in turmoil. The ride home felt surreal as she replayed the conversation over and over in her head. This wasn't a fairy tale offer, it was a transaction. Plain and simple. But as she thought of her mother and the life she'd been struggling to maintain, one question lingered: was she willing to sacrifice her heart for security? By the time the clock struck 5, Emily was standing in Ethan's office, pen in hand. Her signature felt heavier than it should have, each stroke of ink binding her to a future she couldn't fully predict. As she set the pen down, Ethan's grey eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, She thought she saw something other than calculation in them, something almost tender. "Welcome to Carter Enterprises, Mrs. Carter," he said. His voice soft but firm. Little did either of them know. That signature wasn't just the beginning of a contract, it was the start of a journey that would change them both in ways they never expected. The next morning, Emily awoke to find a sleek black car waiting outside her modest apartment. The driver, polite and efficient, loaded her small suitcase into the trunk and opened the door for her. She barely had time to process the whirlwind of the past day before she found herself in front of Ethan Carter's penthouse. The building itself was as imposing as its owner, an architectural masterpiece of glass and steel towering over the city skyline. The concierge greeted her with a warm smile, as though her presence was expected and welcomed. As Emily stepped inside, the elevator whisked her up to the top floor, silent and smooth, her heartbeat the loudest sound in the confined space. The penthouse was breathtaking. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in natural light, showcasing a panoramic view of the bustling city below. Everything was immaculate, modern, minimalist, and yet somehow inviting. The scent of fresh flowers lingered in the air, and a vase of vibrant lilies sat on a marble table near the entrance. Ethan was already waiting in the living area, seated on a leather armchair with his phone in hand. He stood as she entered, his movements precise and purposeful. He was dressed casually today, in a light grey sweater and dark trousers, but the sharpness of his presence was undiminished. "You're punctual," he noted, a faint hint of approval in his tone. "I figured it was the least I could do," Emily replied, setting her bag down by the door. She felt awkward in the luxurious surroundings, hyper-aware of her every movement. Ethan gestured toward the couch. "Please, sit." As she did, a housekeeper appeared, carrying a tray with coffee and pastries. Emily declined politely, her appetite non-existent despite the tantalizing aroma of freshly brewed coffee. Ethan sat across from her, his expression measured but curious. "How are you feeling?" She hesitated. "Honestly, a little overwhelmed." "That's to be expected," he replied. "But I want you to understand something, Emily. While this is, first and foremost, a business arrangement, I intend to ensure that you're comfortable here." Emily raised an eyebrow. "Comfortable living in a penthouse and attending corporate events as your wife? Sounds easy enough." Ethan's lips quirked into a faint smile. "It's not as simple as it seems. The scrutiny, the constant presence of the media, it can be suffocating. I've had years to adapt. You haven't." Her mind flickered to the contract she'd signed, the terms and conditions that had felt so clinical at the time. Now, sitting across from Ethan in this lavish space, the reality of her new life was beginning to sink in. "I'll manage," she said finally, lifting her chin. "I don't back down easily." His smile deepened, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Good. You'll need that resilience." As the day progressed, Emily was introduced to the team that would help her transition into her role as Mrs. Carter. A stylist, a social secretary, and a PR consultant were all lined up, each one armed with an array of plans, schedules, and guidelines. It was a crash course in transformation, designed to mold her into the perfect corporate spouse. By the time the stylist left her with a rack of designer dresses, Emily was exhausted. She wandered back into the living room, where Ethan was engrossed in a conference call. He ended the call as she entered, his gaze flickering to her face with an almost imperceptible softness. "Long day?" he asked, setting his phone aside. "You could say that," she replied, sinking into the couch opposite him. "I didn't realize being a CEO's wife required so much training." Ethan's lips twitched in amusement. "You're doing well." "Am I?" she asked, leaning back against the cushions. "Because I feel like I'm in over my head." He studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he stood and poured her a glass of water, handing it to her before sitting down beside her. "You're not the only one adapting," he said quietly. Emily turned to him, surprised by the admission. You seem so, in control all the time. Control is an illusion, he replied, his tone softer than she'd ever heard it. The truth is, this is new territory for both of us. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you're capable of far more than you think. His words struck a chord, and for the first time since signing the contract, Emily felt a glimmer of reassurance. They might not have chosen this path out of love, but there was a kind of mutual respect forming between them, a fragile foundation. But a foundation nonetheless. That evening, as she settled into the guest room, her designated space until she felt ready to move into the master bedroom, Emily found herself staring out at the city lights. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, but it was accompanied by a flicker of hope. She had stepped into this arrangement for her mother, for financial stability, for a chance to rewrite her future. But now, as she thought of Ethan's quiet moments of honesty, she wondered if there might be something more waiting for her in this strange, uncharted life. Neither of them knew it yet, but the walls they had both carefully built were already beginning to crack. The following weeks swept by in a whirlwind of events, meetings, and the carefully orchestrated public unveiling of Emily and Ethan's marriage. Emily quickly learned that her new life revolved around not just Ethan's company but also the meticulous dance of appearances that came with being Mrs. Carter. Their first major public event as a couple was a charity gala hosted by Carter Enterprises. It was an annual affair, attended by the city's most influential figures. And this year, all eyes were on Ethan and his new wife. Emily stood before the full-length mirror in her room, adjusting the dark green evening gown that hugged her figure elegantly. The stylist had insisted on this particular dress, claiming it complemented her auburn hair and brought out her eyes. She had to admit, they weren't wrong. It did make her feel like she belonged in Ethan's world, even if the thought still unsettled her. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, expecting one of the house staff. Instead, it was Ethan. He was already dressed for the gala, his sharp black tuxedo tailored to perfection. For a moment, she was struck by how effortlessly he carried himself, exuding confidence and control as though it were second nature. "You look stunning," he said, his voice softer than she was used to. "Thank you," she replied, turning to face him. "I hope I don't embarrass you tonight." He frowned slightly. "Why would you think that?" "This isn't exactly my scene," she admitted, gesturing to the gown and the makeup she'd spent hours perfecting. "I'm not sure I'll fit in." Ethan stepped closer, his grey eyes steady on hers. "You don't need to fit in, Emily. You're here because you're strong, intelligent, and capable. The rest is just noise." His words surprised her, but they also steadied her nerves. She gave him a small smile. "Well, I'll do my best to live up to that." "Good," he replied, offering his arm. "Shall we?" The gala was everything Emily had expected, grand, glittering, and buzzing with the hum of power and influence. Chandeliers cast a warm glow over the ballroom, where elegantly dressed guests mingled and sipped champagne. She felt every pair of eyes on her as they descended the staircase together. But Ethan's presence at her side gave her an unexpected sense of calm. Throughout the evening, Emily found herself navigating conversations with politicians, CEOs, and socialites. At first, the sheer volume of attention overwhelmed her. But as the night wore on, she discovered that her instincts as a financial analyst served her well. She could read between the lines of polite chatter, spotting veiled compliments and subtle power plays with surprising ease. At one point, she was speaking with a board member of Carter Enterprises, an older man who seemed determined to test her resolve. "Mrs. Carter," he said, his tone bordering on condescending. "You must find it daunting, stepping into such a prominent role." Emily met his gaze evenly, a polite smile on her lips. "I'd be lying if I said it wasn't a challenge. But I've always believed that challenges are opportunities in disguise." The board member raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting such a confident response. "Ethan, who had been standing nearby, stepped in with a slight smirk. "That's one of the reasons I married her. Emily doesn't back down." The board member chuckled, clearly impressed, and moved on. When they were alone again, Emily glanced at Ethan. "Was that a compliment?" "An observation," he replied, but the faint curve of his lips suggested otherwise. Later that night, as they sat at their designated table, Emily found herself watching Ethan as he spoke with a group of executives. He was utterly composed, his words measured and precise. But there was something about his demeanor that struck her as guarded. It was as though he carried the weight of the entire room on his shoulders. "Do you ever take a break from being perfect?" she asked quietly when the others had left. Ethan turned to her, his expression softening just a fraction. "Perfect is a facade, Emily. It's the armor I wear to keep people from seeing the cracks." The honesty in his words caught her off guard. "And what about me? Do I get to see the cracks?" His gaze lingered on her for a moment, something unspoken passing between them. "Perhaps," he said, his voice low, "if you're patient." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of a microphone tapping. Ethan's assistant, a composed woman named Clara, was on stage, signaling for the room's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," Clara announced, "please welcome our host for the evening, Mr. Ethan Carter." Ethan rose, his presence commanding as he approached the stage. Emily watched him deliver his speech, his words confident and inspiring. But as the crowd erupted into applause, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to Ethan Carter than the world knew. By the time they returned to the penthouse, the night had taken its toll. Emily kicked off her heels with a sigh, grateful to be out of the spotlight. "You handled yourself well tonight," Ethan said as he poured himself a glass of whiskey. "Did I?" she replied, settling onto the couch, "because I felt like I was faking it the entire time." He sat beside her, his expression thoughtful. "We're all faking it, Emily. The key is to make it convincing." She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You make it sound so easy." "It's not," he admitted, his voice quiet. "But it helps to have someone who understands." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of the day lifting just enough to let them breathe. As Emily glanced at Ethan, she realized that their arrangement, for all its complexities, had started to feel less transactional. There was something real beginning to grow between them, fragile but undeniable. And for the first time, she wondered if this marriage might hold more than just promises on paper. The days following the gala settled into a strange but steady rhythm. Emily was beginning to understand the layers of Ethan Carter, not just the polished CEO who commanded boardrooms but the man behind the mask. He had an air of quiet complexity, and every so often, a moment of vulnerability would peek through, leaving her intrigued and unexpectedly drawn to him. Their marriage had started as a contract, but as they spent more time together, Emily found herself questioning the boundaries she had carefully constructed in her mind. They were spending evenings discussing company strategies, Ethan listening intently to her analyses, and even her sharpest criticisms. He didn't just humor her, he challenged her, pushing her to refine her ideas. It was intoxicating in its own way, a meeting of equals that went far beyond their roles as husband and wife on paper. One late evening, Emily sat in the library, surrounded by bookshelves that stretched to the ceiling. The room had become her sanctuary, a place to unwind after the relentless pace of her new life. She had just opened a novel when Ethan walked in, carrying 2 steaming mugs. "I thought you might need this," he said, handing her one. She accepted it gratefully. "Chamomile tea? You're learning." He smirked as he sat across from her, cradling his own mug. "Don't let it go to your head." They sat in silence for a while, the kind that felt comfortable rather than awkward. Emily found herself watching him over the rim of her mug, noticing the slight relaxation in his posture, the way his tie hung loose around his neck. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked suddenly. "Miss what?" he replied, his voice soft. Being normal, she said. Before all of this, before the company. The expectations. The constant scrutiny. He leaned back. His grey eyes thoughtful. Normal is a luxury I never had. Even as a kid. My father made sure of that. Emily hesitated before speaking. You've never talked about him much. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, and she worried she had crossed a line. But then he sighed. His shoulders dropping just enough to reveal the weight he carried. My father built Carter Enterprises from nothing, he began. His tone measured. He was brilliant but ruthless. To him, everything was a transaction, a means to an end. Including family. She set her mug down. Her curiosity piqued. That sounds difficult. It was, he admitted. But it taught me to see the world for what it is. Trust is rare. Loyalty even rarer. He used to say emotions were liabilities. Distractions from the bigger picture. Emily frowned. Do you believe that? I did, he said. His gaze locking onto hers. Until recently. The way he looked at her made her heart skip. And she quickly busied herself with her tea. She wasn't ready to unpack what that meant, not yet. What about your family? He asked. Shifting the focus. Emily hesitated. It's just my mom and me. My dad left when I was little. He couldn't handle the responsibility. I guess. My mom worked 2 jobs to keep us afloat. Ethan's expression softened. That must have been hard. It was, she said. But she's the strongest person I know. She taught me that you don't need much to be happy, just the people who matter. He nodded slowly. As if her words had struck a chord. She must be proud of you. I hope so. Emily replied. Her voice tinged with emotion. Though I haven't exactly told her the full story about this. This, he echoed. Smirking. You mean your whirlwind romance with the city's most eligible bachelor? She rolled her eyes. But her smile was genuine. Something like that. Their conversation drifted into lighter topics after that. But the intimacy lingered. For the first time, Emily felt as though she wasn't just navigating the complexities of their arrangement, she was beginning to understand the man she had married. The turning point came one rainy afternoon. Ethan had invited her to accompany him to a meeting with a key investor. A formidable woman named Victoria Hargrove. Emily had studied the brief thoroughly, determined to make a good impression. The meeting was held at an upscale restaurant. The kind where deals were sealed over glasses of rare wine. Victoria was every bit as intimidating as Emily had expected, sharp, commanding, and utterly unimpressed with pretense. I'll be blunt. Ethan. Victoria said, leaning forward. Your company is in a strong position now. But the market is volatile. I need to know that you have the stability to weather the storm. We do. Ethan replied smoothly. The numbers speak for themselves. It's not just about numbers. Victoria said. Her piercing gaze shifting to Emily. It's about trust. Partnerships aren't built on spreadsheets alone. Emily met Victoria's eyes. Feeling the weight of the moment. Trust is earned, she said evenly. And so far, Carter Enterprises has proven that it delivers on its promises. But I understand if you have doubts, any smart investor would. So let me make you one of mine, if you give us the chance. We'll exceed your expectations. Victoria raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. You're bold. Mrs. Carter. I like that. By the end of the meeting, Victoria had agreed to extend her partnership with Carter Enterprises. But it wasn't until they were back in the car that Ethan spoke. You were incredible in there, he said. His voice filled with genuine admiration. I just said what needed to be said. Emily replied, though her cheeks flushed at the compliment. No, he insisted. His gaze steady. You turned a skeptic into an ally. That's not something just anyone can do. The praise warmed her. But it also left her feeling slightly vulnerable. Well, I guess I'm learning from the best. Ethan smiled. But there was something deeper in his expression, something that made her heart ache in a way she couldn't quite explain. As the car rolled through the rain-soaked streets, Emily realized that the line between their contract and their connection was becoming harder to define. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to keep it separate. Days turned into weeks, and Emily found herself more and more entrenched in Ethan's world. What had started as a calculated agreement to save his position at Carter Enterprises was now something far more complex. Every interaction with him revealed layers she hadn't expected: his humor, his quiet strength, and the flickers of vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. One evening, as the city outside their penthouse sparkled with lights, Emily sat in the living room, flipping through financial reports Ethan had left on the coffee table. She had become his confidant in ways she hadn't anticipated, often discussing company matters late into the night. "You're working harder than my board members." Ethan's voice came from behind her, warm and teasing. She turned to find him leaning casually against the doorway, his tie loosened and his jacket slung over one shoulder. "Maybe that's because I care more," she replied with a small smile, holding up a page. "Your projections for the merger are aggressive. Are you sure the board will back you?" He walked over and sank into the armchair across from her, his gaze intent. "They will. And if they don't, I'll convince them." Emily laughed softly. "You make it sound so simple." "It is," he said, though there was an edge of weariness in his tone. "When you've been playing this game as long as I have, you learn how to stay 10 steps ahead." She hesitated before asking, "Does it ever get lonely, being 10 steps ahead?" "I mean." Ethan looked at her, something flickering in his expression. "It does," he admitted quietly, "but that's the price of staying in control." The words lingered in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Emily thought of her own life before this: her modest apartment, her carefully budgeted meals, and her relentless drive to provide for her mother. She had been alone too, though for entirely different reasons. "You don't have to be," she said softly, almost without thinking. Ethan's eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. But before he could respond, his phone buzzed on the table, shattering the moment. He picked it up with a sigh, his expression hardening as he read the message. "What is it?" Emily asked, concern creeping into her voice. "Trouble," he said, standing abruptly. "I have to handle this." "Do you need me to come with you?" she offered, half expecting him to brush her off. But to her surprise, he paused. "Actually, yes. I think you should." The car ride to the Carter Enterprises headquarters was tense, the air thick with anticipation. Ethan explained the situation briefly. A rogue board member had leaked sensitive information about the company's upcoming merger, threatening to derail months of negotiations. It was a calculated move, designed to undermine Ethan's authority and sow doubt among the shareholders. As they stepped into the sleek conference room, Emily felt the weight of the moment. The board members were already seated, their expressions ranging from concerned to outright accusatory. Ethan took his place at the head of the table, his presence commanding as always. "I assume everyone's seen the reports," he began, his voice cold and steady. "Let me be clear, this leak does not change our position. The merger is still on track, and the projections remain solid." "Projections?" scoffed one board member, a grey-haired man named Donovan. "Are we supposed to trust numbers alone? This leak has already shaken investor confidence. What's your plan to mitigate the fallout?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Emily spoke up. "Mr. Donovan," she said evenly, her voice cutting through the tension. "The leak was unfortunate, but it doesn't negate the fundamentals of the deal. Carter Enterprises is acquiring a company with a proven track record and valuable assets. The numbers don't just speak for themselves, they scream confidence." Donovan's eyes narrowed. "And who exactly are you to weigh in on this?" Emily met his gaze without flinching. "Someone who spent the last 2 months analyzing every aspect of this merger. Someone who understands that emotional reactions are the enemy of sound business decisions. The leak is a distraction, and if you let it dictate your actions, You're playing right into the hands of whoever orchestrated it. The room fell silent. And for a moment, Emily wondered if she had overstepped. But then Ethan spoke. His voice laced with quiet pride. She's right, he said. This merger is about long-term growth and stability. I won't let a short-term setback derail that. The rest of the meeting passed in a blur of tense discussions and strategic planning. But by the end, it was clear that Ethan had regained the board's confidence. As they left the building, he turned to Emily, his expression unreadable. You didn't have to do that, he said, though there was no trace of reprimand in his tone. I know, she replied, shrugging. But I wanted to. He shook his head, a small smile playing at his lips. You're something else, Emily. Later that night, back in the penthouse, Emily found herself replaying the events of the day. Standing up for Ethan had felt natural, almost instinctive. But it was more than that. It was about proving to him, and perhaps to herself, that she was more than just a placeholder wife in a transactional marriage. As she curled up in bed, her thoughts drifted to Ethan. Despite his guarded exterior, he had let her into his world, piece by piece. And the more she saw, the more she realized that this wasn't just about a contract anymore. It was about trust, about connection, and maybe, just maybe, about something deeper. The next few weeks brought a shift in the air between Ethan and Emily. What had once been a marriage of convenience now carried the subtle tension of something unspoken, something growing between them. Their days were filled with meetings, strategy sessions, and public appearances designed to strengthen Ethan's position as CEO. But in the quiet moments, away from the scrutiny of the board and the press, Emily began to notice the cracks in Ethan's armor and the man beneath. One evening, after a particularly grueling day, they found themselves in the kitchen together. Emily was rummaging through the fridge, searching for something to eat. When Ethan walked in, his tie already loosened. You know we have a private chef, he remarked, leaning against the counter with a faint smile. Yes. But I don't need an elaborate meal, she replied, pulling out a carton of eggs. Sometimes simple is better. Ethan raised an eyebrow as she cracked the eggs into a bowl. You're going to cook? Don't sound so surprised, Emily teased, whisking the eggs with practiced ease. I had to learn a few things living on my own. He watched her with interest, his usual polished demeanor softened by exhaustion. What's on the menu? Then, scrambled eggs and toast, she said, setting a pan on the stove. It's nothing fancy, but it's comforting. Ethan stayed silent for a moment, then moved to grab plates from the cabinet. Comfort sounds nice. As they worked together in the kitchen, a sense of ease settled over them. It was a stark contrast to the formal dinners they'd attended together, where every word and gesture was carefully measured. Here, in the quiet hum of the kitchen, they were just Ethan and Emily, two people navigating the complexities of their arrangement and perhaps something more. When the food was ready, they sat at the small breakfast nook, their plates steaming with the simplicity of the meal. Emily took a bite and sighed contentedly. See, nothing wrong with basic. Ethan chuckled softly, his gaze lingering on her. I think this is the first time I've seen you genuinely relax. She looked up, surprised. I could say the same about you. His smile faltered slightly, and he leaned back in his chair. I guess I don't relax much. Why not? She asked, her voice gentle. He hesitated, his eyes dropping to his plate. It's hard to let your guard down when you've spent your whole life building walls. Emily studied him, her heart aching at the quiet vulnerability in his words. You don't have to be so guarded all the time. You know. Not with me. Ethan's gaze met hers, and for a moment, the weight of their shared secrets seemed to lift. You make it sound so easy. It's not, she admitted. But it's worth it. They finished their meal in companionable silence. But the moment lingered long after the plates were cleared. Emily couldn't help but feel that they had crossed an invisible line. one that brought them closer to understanding each other in ways she hadn't thought possible. The following morning, Emily woke to the smell of coffee. She padded into the kitchen, still in her pajamas, to find Ethan at the counter, 2 steaming mugs in front of him. "Morning," he said, sliding one of the mugs toward her. She smiled sleepily. "You made coffee?" "I figured it was my turn to keep things simple," he replied with a smirk. Emily took a sip and sighed appreciatively. "You're full of surprises." He shrugged. But there was a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking." "About what?" she asked, leaning against the counter. "About us," he said, his tone measured. "About how this whole arrangement started and how it's changed." Her heart skipped a beat, but she forced herself to stay composed. "And what have you decided?" Ethan hesitated, his fingers curling around his mug. "I think I underestimated you, Emily. You're not just someone I married to secure my position. You've become important to me." The honesty in his voice caught her off guard, and she felt a rush of warmth she hadn't expected. "You're important to me too," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. They stood there for a moment, the weight of their words hanging in the air. But before the moment could deepen, Ethan's phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen and sighed. "Duty calls," he said, his expression shifting back to businesslike efficiency. "There's a meeting with the board in an hour." Emily nodded, though her chest felt tight. "I'll be ready." As Ethan left the kitchen, she stared into her coffee, her thoughts a whirlwind. It wasn't just about the contract anymore, that much was clear. But what it was, and where it would lead, was still a mystery. That afternoon, as they prepared for the meeting, Emily found herself watching Ethan more closely than usual. He was meticulous, confident, every bit the leader Carter Enterprises needed. But she also saw the weight he carried, the pressure to succeed that seemed to follow him everywhere. The meeting itself was tense, with discussions of the merger and its potential risks dominating the agenda. Emily contributed where she could, offering insights that earned her nods of approval from even the most skeptical board members. But it was Ethan's steady leadership that ultimately won them over, his vision for the company shining through despite the challenges. When the meeting finally adjourned, Ethan caught her arm as they left the conference room. "You were incredible in there," he said, his voice low. "So were you," she replied, smiling up at him. "You always are." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the noise of the bustling office fading into the background. And in that moment, Emily felt something shift, something undeniable. This was no longer just a marriage of convenience. It was becoming something real, something that neither of them had planned for. And as they walked out of the building together, side by side, Emily couldn't help but wonder what the future held for them and whether they were brave enough to embrace it. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity, with the merger entering its final stages and tensions running high across the board. Emily and Ethan became a team in every sense of the word, their collaboration extending far beyond the terms of their contract. But even as their professional partnership grew stronger, the lines between business and personal blurred in ways neither of them had anticipated. It was a Friday evening when Ethan suggested a quiet dinner at the penthouse. "We've earned a break," he said, loosening his tie as he walked through the door. "No board meetings, no reports, just good food and some peace." Emily smiled, grateful for the reprieve. "That sounds perfect." They ordered takeout from a small Italian restaurant that Emily had mentioned loving. The simplicity of the meal, eaten at the kitchen island with glasses of wine, felt like a breath of fresh air after the chaos of their work lives. As they lingered over dessert, shared tiramisu from a single plate, Ethan looked at her thoughtfully. "You've changed this place," he said, his tone soft. "What do you mean?" she asked. Her fork paused mid-air. "When I moved in, it was just a space," he admitted. "A place to sleep, work, and wait for the next deal. But now, with you here, it feels like home." Emily's heart fluttered at his words. But she kept her tone light. Are you saying my obsession with throw pillows has finally paid off? He chuckled, shaking his head. It's not the pillows, Emily. It's you. The intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. And for a moment, she felt like the world had narrowed to just the two of them. She wanted to say something, to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing between them. But she hesitated. The contract still loomed in the background, a reminder of how their relationship had started. Instead, she reached for the wine bottle. More. Ethan didn't press the moment. Sure, he said, holding out his glass. But the look in his eyes told her he wasn't letting go of what he'd said or what he'd meant. That weekend, they attended a charity gala hosted by one of Ethan's business partners. The event was lavish, held in the grand ballroom of a historic hotel. And the guest list read like a who's who of the corporate world. Emily wore a sleek, midnight blue gown that clung to her curves in all the right places. When she stepped out of their room, Ethan, dressed in a tailored black tuxedo, froze for a moment, his expression unreadable. You look stunning, he said, his voice low and almost reverent. Thank you, she replied, feeling a warmth rise to her cheeks. You don't look so bad yourself. As they made their way through the crowd that evening, Emily noticed how naturally they fit together. Ethan introduced her with pride, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. She, in turn, charmed their hosts and fielded questions with the poise of someone who had been doing this for years. But as the evening wore on, Emily began to sense an undercurrent of tension in Ethan. It wasn't until they stepped away from the ballroom for a quiet moment that she addressed it. Something's bothering you, she said softly. What is it? Ethan hesitated, his jaw tightening. It's nothing. Ethan, she pressed, placing a hand on his arm. You can talk to me. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. There are people here tonight who wouldn't hesitate to see me fail, he admitted. The merger is making waves. And not everyone is happy about it. Emily's brows furrowed. Do you think someone is trying to sabotage it? Maybe, he said, his voice grim. It's hard to tell in this world. Everyone smiles to your face while planning their next move behind your back. She reached for his hand, her touch grounding him. You're not alone in this, Ethan. We'll figure it out together. Her words seemed to steady him, and he gave her a small, grateful smile. I don't know what I'd do without you. Later that night, as they danced to the soft strains of a jazz band, Emily felt the weight of Ethan's words settle in her chest. She rested her head against his shoulder, letting herself be swept away by the music and the warmth of his embrace. I never thought I'd be here, Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible over the music. Where? She asked, looking up at him. With someone who sees past the facade, he said, his grey eyes searching hers. Who cares about more than just the title or the money? Emily's breath caught, and for a moment, she couldn't speak. She felt the truth of his words resonate deep within her, echoing the feelings she had been too afraid to name. You deserve that, she said finally, her voice steady. You deserve someone who sees you for who you really are. For the first time, Ethan didn't deflect or change the subject. He simply held her closer, as if trying to hold on to the moment for as long as possible. And as they swayed together under the soft glow of the chandeliers, Emily couldn't help but wonder if they were finally ready to face the truth of what they had become together. The morning after the gala dawned quiet and serene. But the peace was short-lived. Ethan's phone buzzed incessantly with calls and notifications as the fallout from the merger negotiations spilled into the new week. Emily, sipping coffee in the kitchen, watched him pace the length of the penthouse, his usually composed demeanor showing cracks. Trouble? She asked, setting her mug down and crossing to his side. He ended his call and sighed heavily. It's Hartford Enterprises. They've filed an injunction to stall the merger. They're claiming it violates antitrust regulations. But it's a flimsy pretense. Emily frowned. What's their real angle? Leverage, he replied. They want a seat at the table. A piece of the pie. And what's your move? She asked, already switching into problem-solving mode. Ethan glanced at her, a small smile breaking through the tension. You've got that look. What look? She asked, feigning innocence. The one that tells me you're about to save the day, he said. The affection in his tone unmistakable. She blushed but didn't let it deter her. Well, maybe I can help. Show me the details. Ethan handed her a tablet with the legal documents, and she spent the next hour poring over them while he handled more calls. The sun rose higher, casting golden light across the penthouse. But Emily hardly noticed, engrossed in the intricacies of Hartford's maneuvering. They're bluffing, she announced finally, looking up to find Ethan watching her from across the room. What makes you so sure? He asked, crossing the space between them. They don't have the resources to sustain a legal battle of this scale, she explained. Their finances have been stretched thin for months. If you counter with a settlement offer that undercuts their demands but saves them face, they'll take it. Ethan raised an eyebrow. You're suggesting I let them win a little? No, she corrected. I'm suggesting you make them think they've won. Give them something inconsequential in exchange for their withdrawal. He studied her for a moment, then nodded slowly. You're brilliant. You know that. She shrugged, but her lips curved into a small smile. You've said it before, but I don't mind hearing it again. The following days were a blur of negotiations, strategy meetings, and carefully worded press releases. Emily stayed by Ethan's side through it all, her insights proving invaluable as they navigated the complexities of the merger. It wasn't lost on Ethan how seamlessly she had integrated into his world, nor how much he relied on her now, not just for her sharp mind, but for her unwavering support. One evening, as they reviewed the final draft of the settlement offer, Emily glanced at Ethan and saw the weariness etched in his features. Without thinking, she reached over and placed a hand on his. You're carrying too much, she said softly. He looked up, startled by the tenderness in her tone. It comes with the territory. It doesn't mean you have to do it alone, she replied. Lean on me, Ethan. That's what I'm here for. The vulnerability in her words made something inside him shift. For so long, he had kept people at arm's length, unwilling to let anyone see the cracks in his armor. But Emily had slipped past his defenses, not by force, but by simply being herself. I don't say it enough, he began, his voice low. But you're the best thing that's happened to me in a long time. Her breath caught at his words, and for a moment, they simply looked at each other, the weight of unspoken emotions filling the space between them. Finally, Emily broke the silence. Let's get this done. The sooner we finish, the sooner we can celebrate. Ethan smiled, the tension in his shoulders easing. You're right. As always. The next day brought a breakthrough. Hartford Enterprises accepted the settlement offer, withdrawing their injunction and clearing the path for the merger to proceed. The news was met with relief and celebration at the office. But Ethan and Emily saved their own celebration for later that evening. They retreated to the penthouse, where Ethan uncorked a bottle of champagne. The fizz bubbled over as he poured them each a glass, and they toasted to their victory, to a future built on persistence and a little luck. Emily said, clinking her glass against his. And to a partner who makes everything better. Ethan added, his gaze lingering on her. As the evening wore on, their conversation shifted from business to lighter topics, travel dreams, childhood memories, and favorite books. It felt effortless, natural, as if they'd known each other for years instead of months. At one point, Ethan reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch lingering. I don't know what I did to deserve you, he said quietly. Emily's heart fluttered, but she managed to keep her voice steady. Maybe you signed the right contract. He laughed softly, shaking his head. It's more than that. You've changed everything. Emily. She opened her mouth to respond, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she reached for his hand, her fingers curling around his as she leaned closer. For a moment, the world fell away, leaving only the two of them in the soft glow of the penthouse lights. It wasn't just the end of a successful negotiation or the culmination of their efforts, it was the beginning of something far deeper. Something they were finally ready to admit. The days that followed their quiet celebration were a whirlwind of activity. But for Emily and Ethan, something fundamental had shifted. Their connection, once defined by the lines of professionalism and obligation, now carried an unspoken depth that neither of them could ignore. Ethan's attention to her became more pronounced. He started noticing the little things, how she hummed under her breath when reviewing documents, the way she bit her lip when deep in thought, and how her laughter could brighten even the most challenging days. Emily, in turn, found herself drawn to his quieter moments. The way his hand lingered on hers when passing her a file, or the way his gaze softened when he thought she wasn't looking. One evening, as they reviewed the finalized merger agreements in Ethan's office, Emily found herself staring at him. The glow of the desk lamp highlighted his strong jawline, the way his dark hair fell slightly over his forehead as he focused. Her heart skipped a beat when he looked up, catching her gaze. "Something on your mind?" he asked, his tone curious but warm. She blinked, startled out of her thoughts. "Just thinking about how far we've come." A smile tugged at his lips, and he leaned back in his chair. "It's been quite a journey, hasn't it?" She nodded, setting her pen down. "I never thought I'd find myself here. Not just in this role but here with you." His expression grew serious as he leaned forward, resting his arms on the desk. "And how do you feel about being here?" Emily hesitated, her heart pounding. There was so much she wanted to say, but fear held her back. "I feel like it's where I'm supposed to be." Ethan's smile softened, and he reached across the desk, his fingers brushing against hers. "I couldn't agree more." The merger was officially announced at a press conference the following week, and the buzz was electric. Journalists clamored for quotes as Ethan and Emily stood side by side, the picture of a united front. Their poised and confident demeanor projected success. But beneath the surface, their personal bond was stronger than ever. As they stepped off the stage, the applause still echoing in the hall, Ethan leaned close to her. "You handled that beautifully." Emily grinned. "I've had a good teacher." He chuckled, his hand briefly grazing her lower back as they walked to the car. It was a small gesture, but it sent a warmth through her that lingered long after they returned to the penthouse. That evening, the weight of the merger lifted. They celebrated with a quiet dinner. Ethan had insisted on cooking, surprising Emily with a meal that was both delicious and thoughtful. "I didn't know you could cook," she said, savoring the roasted salmon and perfectly steamed vegetables. "There's a lot you don't know about me," he replied with a teasing smile. "But I'm happy to reveal more, if you're interested." Emily laughed, but there was a note of sincerity in her response. "I think I'd like that." As the night wore on, the conversation turned introspective. They shared stories from their pasts. Ethan talked about his late mother's influence on his career, and Emily opened up about the challenges of supporting her family through difficult times. Each story brought them closer, weaving a tapestry of understanding and empathy between them. At one point, Emily glanced at Ethan, her heart full. "Do you ever think about where you'd be if things had gone differently? If you hadn't offered me that contract?" Ethan's gaze met hers, and the intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. "Every day. But the truth is, Emily, I don't want to imagine a life where you're not part of it." Her throat tightened, and she looked away, overwhelmed. "You have a way of saying things that make it impossible to argue." He reached across the table, gently tilting her chin so she had to meet his eyes. "Good. Because I mean every word." As the weeks passed, their partnership continued to flourish. Both professionally and personally, they worked seamlessly together, their combined strengths driving the company forward. But outside the office, Their relationship deepened in ways that surprised them both. One weekend, Ethan suggested a trip to the countryside, a chance to escape the pressures of the city and reconnect. Emily hesitated at first, worried about leaving work behind. But his insistence won her over. The estate they visited was breathtaking, surrounded by rolling hills and vibrant wildflowers. As they walked through the fields, the tension that had weighed on them for months seemed to melt away. This was a good idea, Emily admitted, her hand brushing against his as they strolled. Ethan glanced at her, his expression unreadable. It's nice to see you like this. Relaxed. Happy. She smiled. It's nice to feel this way. They stopped at the crest of a hill, the sun casting a golden glow over the landscape. Ethan turned to her, his voice low. Emily, I know we started this journey with boundaries and rules, but I can't pretend anymore. Her heart pounded as he continued, his words measured but earnest. You've become more than just a partner to me. You've become my reason to look forward to each day. My reason to fight for what matters. Tears pricked at her eyes as she reached for his hand. Ethan. He silenced her with a soft kiss, his hands cradling her face as the world seemed to hold its breath. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, his voice a whisper. No more contracts. No more rules. Just us. Emily nodded, her voice trembling. Just us. The weeks following their countryside escape were a blur of happiness and adjustment. Ethan and Emily had made their commitment clear to one another, and though they continued their professional duties with utmost dedication, there was an undeniable shift in their dynamic. The people around them noticed it too, not just the closeness they shared, but the ease with which they navigated challenges together. They were no longer just a CEO and his partner, they were two halves of a whole. At the office, meetings became a curious mix of sharp professionalism and subtle warmth. Ethan, who had once been known for his unyielding demeanor, now often looked to Emily for input, their shared glances filled with trust. Emily, for her part, carried herself with newfound confidence, knowing she had a partner who believed in her completely. One evening, after a particularly intense negotiation with a new client, Ethan leaned back in his chair and sighed. That was a close one, he said, rubbing his temples. Emily looked up from her notes, her expression amused. Close. You had them wrapped around your finger by the end. He chuckled, dropping his hands and smiling at her. Maybe. But I couldn't have done it without you. She shook her head. You give me too much credit. Never, he replied, his tone soft but firm. You've earned every bit of it. Her cheeks warmed under his gaze. And for a moment, the world outside their office seemed to fade away. It was in moments like these that Emily felt the weight of how much things had changed, how much she had changed. What had begun as a contract, a simple arrangement to meet mutual needs, had grown into something profound and transformative. Their personal lives, too, became increasingly intertwined. Ethan began spending more evenings at Emily's apartment, the space slowly filling with signs of his presence. His tailored suits found a home in her closet. His books appeared on her shelves, and his favorite coffee mugs joined hers in the kitchen. One evening, as they were cooking dinner together, a newfound ritual they both enjoyed, Ethan paused, a thoughtful expression on his face. You know, he said, stirring the sauce, we could make this a little more official. Emily glanced up from chopping vegetables, raising an eyebrow. Official? Are you proposing we write up another contract? He laughed, setting the spoon down and turning to face her. No contracts this time. I'm talking about us living together. Her hands stilled, her heart skipping a beat. You mean, move in together? He nodded, his expression earnest. It makes sense, doesn't it? We're already spending most of our time together. And honestly, Emily, I can't think of anywhere I'd rather be than by your side. Her breath caught at the sincerity in his words. She placed the knife down and turned to face him fully. Ethan, Are you sure? This isn't just about convenience. Right. He stepped closer, his hands settling gently on her waist. Convenience, he echoed, his voice low. Emily, you're the best part of my life. I don't want convenience. I want you. Tears prickled her eyes, and she laughed softly, brushing them away. When you say things like that, how am I supposed to say no? His grin widened, and he pulled her into a warm embrace. That's the idea. Their decision to move in together brought with it a cascade of changes. Ethan insisted on finding a place that felt like theirs, not just his or hers. After weeks of searching, they settled on a beautiful brownstone with large windows that let in streams of light and a cozy living space that felt like home the moment they walked through the door. Unpacking was an adventure in itself, filled with laughter and compromises. Ethan had an impeccable sense of style but was utterly sentimental when it came to certain items. Emily discovered this when she unearthed an old, worn-out chair he refused to part with. "You're kidding," she said, holding it up. "This doesn't go with anything else we own." "It's comfortable," he protested, a sheepish smile on his face. She crossed her arms, trying to maintain a serious expression. "Comfortable doesn't mean it belongs in our living room." "Fine," he relented, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "But it stays in the study." She rolled her eyes but laughed. Relenting. Deal. For every quirky chair Ethan refused to give up, Emily had her own sentimental attachments. Her collection of mismatched mugs, each with its own story, was a source of endless amusement for him. "Do we really need all of these?" he teased one morning, holding up a mug emblazoned with a cartoon cat. "Yes," she replied firmly. "They have character. Just like you," he said, leaning in to kiss her. As they settled into their new life together, the brownstone became a sanctuary, a place where they could truly be themselves. Evenings were spent cooking, reading, or simply enjoying each other's company, while weekends were dedicated to exploring their neighborhood and hosting small gatherings for friends and colleagues. One night, as they sat on the couch with a bottle of wine, Emily rested her head on Ethan's shoulder and sighed contentedly. "This feels right," she said softly. "It does," he agreed, his hand stroking her hair. "It feels like home." She looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotion. "Ethan, Before she could finish, he pressed a finger to her lips, his eyes warm and tender. "You don't have to say anything, Emily. I already know." And in that moment, as they sat together in the quiet comfort of their home, Emily realized just how far they had come. Their journey had been anything but conventional, but it had brought them to a place of love, trust, and unshakable partnership. It was, she thought, the beginning of something truly extraordinary. With their new home settled and their lives comfortably intertwined, Ethan and Emily began exploring what it truly meant to build a future together. Their days were filled with the familiar rhythm of work, but their nights were something else entirely, a quiet, shared joy that reminded them both of how far they'd come since their contract began. Emily had begun noticing the subtle ways Ethan's demeanor had shifted. He was still the decisive, sharp businessman who could command a room with ease. But there was a softness to him now, an openness that made her feel as though she'd unlocked a part of him no one else had ever seen. It was during one of those quiet evenings, with the soft glow of the fireplace filling their living room, that Ethan surprised her. "I've been thinking about us," he began, his tone thoughtful as he swirled his glass of wine. Emily smiled, tucking her legs beneath her on the couch. "That sounds serious." "It is," he replied, his gaze steady on her. "We've been through so much together, Emily. And not just the things people see. The moments we've shared, the decisions we've made, they mean everything to me." Her heart skipped a beat as she leaned closer. "Ethan, where is this going?" He reached for her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "I want us to take the next step." She raised an eyebrow, though her heart was already racing. "The next step. I want to make it official," he said, his voice steady and sure. No contracts. No conditions, just you and me. For the rest of our lives. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily felt a swell of emotions rise in her chest: love, joy, and the unmistakable certainty that this was exactly where she was meant to be. "Are you proposing, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her voice teasing but her eyes glistening with unshed tears. He grinned, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small, velvet box. "I suppose I am." When he opened it, the ring inside caught the firelight, sparkling brilliantly, but it wasn't the ring that made Emily gasp, it was the thoughtfulness of the design. A delicate, understated band with an intricate pattern of intertwined leaves. It was elegant yet simple, perfectly reflective of her. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice trembling. Ethan took her hand in his gaze never leaving hers. "You're beautiful, Emily. And I want to spend every day proving to you how much you mean to me." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. Unable to find the words, he slipped the ring onto her finger. And it fit perfectly, as though it had always belonged there. "Yes," she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. 1,000 times. "Yes." Their engagement became a quiet, shared secret in the days that followed. They weren't in any rush to make announcements or plan elaborate celebrations. For now, it was enough to savor the knowledge that they had chosen each other, fully and completely. Still, the change didn't go unnoticed by those closest to them. Ethan's sister, Clara, was the first to suspect something. "You're glowing," she remarked one afternoon as she and Emily met for coffee. "And don't tell me it's just the caffeine." Emily laughed, though her hand instinctively brushed against the ring she now wore. "Maybe it's just happiness." Clara's eyes narrowed playfully. Happiness? Or a certain someone? Unable to keep it to herself any longer, Emily held out her hand, the ring glinting in the sunlight. Clara gasped, her face breaking into a wide grin. "Oh my God," she exclaimed, drawing attention from the surrounding tables. "He finally did it. I knew it. I just knew it." Emily blushed, laughing as Clara reached across the table to hug her. "You're happy about this?" "Happy?" Clara sat back, her expression incredulous. "Emily, you've made my brother into a completely different person. I've never seen him this, alive. You're perfect for each other." The words filled Emily with warmth, solidifying what she already knew in her heart. This was right. This was real. Back at the office, Ethan's demeanor had shifted as well. Though he remained professional, there was a newfound ease to his interactions. He seemed more present, more grounded, as though he'd finally found the balance he'd been seeking for so long. One afternoon, as they prepared for an important board meeting, Emily caught him watching her from across the room. His expression was one of quiet admiration. And when their eyes met, he smiled. "What?" she asked, tilting her head. "Nothing," he replied, though his smile deepened. "I just like seeing you like this." "Like what?" "Confident. In your element. It's inspiring." Her cheeks flushed, but she held his gaze. "You've always believed in me, Ethan. That's what made all the difference." As they entered the boardroom, side by side, Emily felt a surge of pride. They weren't just partners in business anymore, they were partners in life. And together, there was nothing they couldn't achieve. The weeks turned into months, and their engagement remained a source of quiet joy. But as the time came to share their news with the world, they both knew it would bring its own set of challenges. "We'll face them together," Ethan said one evening as they sat on the balcony of their brownstone, the city lights twinkling around them. Emily leaned into his side, her hand resting over his heart. "Always." And with that, they stepped into the next chapter of their lives, ready to face whatever came their way, as long as they had each other. As the news of their engagement began to ripple through their inner circle, Ethan and Emily prepared for what came next, making it public. In their world, every personal milestone became a professional spectacle. And they both knew the stakes. But they were determined to control the narrative, to ensure their story was told their way. The first step was a carefully planned dinner with the board members of Carter Enterprises. Ethan understood the importance of presenting their engagement not just as a personal choice but as a strategic move that reinforced stability within the company. Emily, now accustomed to the subtle power dynamics of the corporate world, was ready to stand beside him. "Are you nervous?" Ethan asked as they dressed for the evening, his hands adjusting his cufflinks with practiced precision. "Not nervous," Emily replied, slipping on an elegant navy dress that hugged her figure just right. "More like, prepared." Ethan smiled, crossing the room to take her hands. "You're going to be amazing. Just be yourself." Emily. That's what won them over in the first place. "And you," she teased, raising an eyebrow. "What won you over?" His expression softened, and he tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Everything." The quiet sincerity in his voice steadied her nerves. And as they left for the restaurant, she felt ready to face whatever awaited them. The dinner was held at one of the city's most exclusive venues, a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered sweeping views of the skyline. The air buzzed with the hum of polite conversation as the board members arrived, each one shaking Ethan's hand before greeting Emily with varying degrees of curiosity. The seating arrangement was deliberate, placing Emily in a prominent position beside Ethan at the head of the table. As the courses were served, she found herself fielding questions about their relationship, her professional background, and her vision for the company's future. Emily, one of the senior members, began, his tone measured. "What would you say is the biggest lesson you've learned since joining Carter Enterprises?" She took a moment to consider her response, feeling Ethan's supportive gaze beside her. "I've learned that success isn't just about strategy or execution," she said confidently. "It's about trust. Trust in your team, trust in your partners, and trust in the decisions you make together." The room fell silent for a beat before the senior member nodded, his expression approving. "Well said." As the evening progressed, the atmosphere relaxed. By the time dessert was served, Emily felt a genuine sense of acceptance from the group. She caught Ethan's eye across the table, and the pride she saw there warmed her heart. When the dinner concluded, Ethan and Emily stepped out into the crisp night air, their driver waiting nearby. Ethan wrapped an arm around her shoulders, pulling her close. "You were incredible," he murmured. "I had a good partner," she replied with a smile. As they climbed into the car, Emily felt a sense of triumph. They'd cleared another hurdle together, and with each one, their bond grew stronger. The next step was the media announcement. They decided on an exclusive interview with a respected business publication, opting for a polished yet personal approach. The photo shoot took place in their brownstone, with a photographer capturing candid moments of the couple working side by side in Ethan's study, sharing a laugh in the kitchen, and enjoying coffee on the balcony. The interview itself delved into their journey, from their professional collaboration to their evolving relationship. Emily spoke about her initial doubts, how she'd come to admire Ethan's vision and determination, and how their partnership had grown into something deeper. Ethan, in turn, revealed a side of himself the public had rarely seen. He spoke of the loss of his parents, the walls he'd built around his heart, and how Emily had taught him to trust again. "She challenges me," he said during the interview, his hand resting over hers. "She makes me better. And that's all I've ever wanted in a partner. In life. And in love." When the article was published, it was met with widespread acclaim. The narrative of the stoic CEO softened by love resonated with readers, and the accompanying photos painted a picture of genuine connection and mutual respect. But with the positive attention came scrutiny. Some questioned whether their engagement was a calculated move to secure Ethan's position within the company. Others speculated about Emily's motives, suggesting she'd strategically placed herself in his life. Emily bristled at the comments, but Ethan was unfazed. "Let them talk," he told her. We know the truth. That's all that matters. And yet, the whispers lingered. A faint undercurrent that followed them into every public appearance. Emily found herself relying on Ethan's steadiness more than ever. His unwavering belief in her helping her to weather the storm. One evening, as they sat on the balcony sharing a bottle of wine, Emily voiced her concerns. "Do you think this will ever stop?" she asked. Her gaze fixed on the city lights. The questioning. The doubt. Ethan reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "People will always find something to question. Emily. It's human nature. But we're not living for them. We're living for us." She turned to him, her heart full. "How do you always know the right thing to say?" "I don't," he admitted with a small smile. "But I know how I feel about you. And that's enough." As they sat together, the doubts faded, replaced by the quiet certainty that their love was stronger than any external noise. They had built something unshakable. And together, they would face whatever came next. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm golden glow across the city, Ethan and Emily stood hand in hand on their balcony, watching the lights flicker to life. Their journey had been anything but conventional, built on a foundation of contracts and expectations. It had grown into a love that defied every doubt and challenge. Together, they had faced storms of scrutiny, fought battles both public and private, and emerged stronger for it. Emily turned to Ethan, her heart swelling as she caught the tender smile that had become her anchor. "Do you think this is our happy ending?" she asked softly. Ethan squeezed her hand, his gaze steady and full of promise. "No," he replied. "This is just the beginning." In that moment, surrounded by the city's vibrant hum, they knew their story was far from over. It wasn't about perfection, it was about love, trust, and the unwavering choice to stand by each other through it all. And so, their next chapter began. A testament to the strength of love that conquers fear and the courage to choose happiness every single day. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories for more heartfelt tales of love, resilience, and transformation. See you in the next story.